Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Madeline Milka, President and CEO of APAICS, the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies. Welcome to today's APAICS In Conversation. We are delighted to have as our special guest, Don Tamaki, who is managing partner of Minami Tamaki, LLP, and served on the legal team that reopened the 1944 U.S. Supreme Court case of Fred Korematsu, overturning his criminal conviction for defying the removal of almost 120,000 Japanese Americans. The American Bar Association honored Don with the 2020 Spirit of Excellence Award for his efforts and accomplishments in promoting a more racially and ethnically diverse legal profession. And as our interviewer today, we have Professor Lorraine Bonai, who's the director of the Fred T. Korematsu Center for Law and Equality, and a professor of lawyering skills at Seattle University School of Law. Along with our guest speaker, Lori also served on the legal team that successfully challenged Fred Korematsu's conviction. Please join us today and give them a warm welcome.
Thank you, Madeline. And thank you, everyone, for inviting us here to talk to you today. I'm just thrilled to be able to be in conversation with my longtime friend and colleague, Don Tamaki. Today, we've known each other for quite a long time, and he's so accomplished and still doing the hard work to advance social justice. So Don, you have such an interesting and varied background, starting out in doing poverty law, frontline direct legal services for indigent communities, to going on to be executive director of the Asian Law Caucus, one of the first Asian legal services, community-based legal services in the country, to going on to a solo practice and a private practice with a really fancy downtown San Francisco address above Tiffany's and Union Square. But all the while, all of that time, you've kept your commitment and you've kept active at the front line on social justice issues, kind of never wavering in that commitment. And so I guess what I'd really like you to share are the choices that you've made along your career path, why you've made those choices, and what skills and kind of principles have really informed those choices.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank APAICS and thank you, Madeline, for that kind introduction. Thank you, Lori. I mean, we've known each other for decades. Participated in many battles together. So really an honor to be interviewed by you. So our generation of Japanese Americans more or less grew up in the shadow of the incarceration. We were born shortly after the camps were closed. And at that time, the West Coast was pretty much still rife with prejudice against Japanese Americans as a result of the war. And as Madeline was, summarizing, the aftermath of almost 120,000 people losing their freedom and their property and so on. And so we were pretty conscious of still being a targeted minority. At the same time, and thinking of things that influenced probably both of our lives, we were so lucky to be alive when Martin Luther King was alive, when John Lewis was alive. And we saw predominantly African-American protesters, marchers, and with white supporters and some Asian Americans and other people of color too, but predominantly African-American, challenging authority in ways we'd never seen and risking their lives under horrendous situations. So that was politicizing, and what shocked the nation and woke everybody up sort of woke us up too, right? And so at the same time, Asian American studies, which probably a lot of the attendees, the viewers have sort of gone through, sort of helped us understand our own history. And with that, I began to look at and question my own past and certainly what my family had gone through. And maybe what I could do is kind of show and tell a little bit about a memento I keep and want to share with you that kind of tells us how far we've come as a people. So if you could see on the screen, this is a photograph of my dad's diploma from UC Berkeley. and also his pharmacy degree from the same institution. However, he wasn't allowed to participate in graduation ceremonies. Why? Because when the war broke out, within weeks, Japanese American communities up and down the West Coast was ordered into temporary military detention centers. And he didn't participate in graduation. But if you look carefully on your screen, you could see the mailing address to which the institution scrolled up his diplomas and then mailed them. And it says Minoru Tamaki, that's my father's name, Barrack 80, Apartment 5, Tanforan Assembly Center. And do you know what Barrack 80, Apartment 5 was? And the answer was a horse stall located at Tanforan Racetrack at the time, surrounded by barbed wire and machine gun towers housing almost 8,000 Japanese Americans from the San Francisco Bay Area. And I keep this as an incentive, really, as a reminder. I look at it now and it's kind of heartbreaking because it's a metaphor, I think, for what Japanese Americans in general went through. The scrolled up diploma is really the promise of the future. It's what America is supposed to be. It's what my parents and family probably had hoped for as recent immigrants, but it's constrained and constricted in a mailing tube addressed to a horse stall at a racetrack. And then following the assembly center at Tanforan, of course, people were taken away to 10 American-style concentration camps from California to Arkansas. So, this is one of the things you asked the question, Lori, what motivates me? The mementos help me kind of understand how far we've come as a people. I appreciate everything our ancestors have done, and particularly other people of color. But I think this is, in a nutshell, is a good reminder for me anyway. It's a good motivator for me.
My family was at Manzanar, as you know. I keep my mother's high school diploma from Manzanar High School. They're really important things for us to hold close, to remember, hopefully that their experiences were not in vain, that we can keep on telling their story. And so this is something that's kind of like really run through your whole career, is telling that story. Have you been able to keep your kind of your commitment with having your day jobs all the way through your career, and keep on telling this story?
Well, I think if it wasn't for Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, I wouldn't have sought to become a lawyer. That was really a very strong motivation. So when I got into Berkeley, I wanted to do poverty law and civil rights. And at that time, Berkeley was $600 a semester. It's not like what young people are going through now. And so you could actually afford to do public service work on a very, minimal salary. I wasn't burdened with gigantic loans as young people are now. And I made a choice that this is what I wanted to do. So I did not go the corporate law route or some of the other more traditional routes. And so I got a poverty law fellowship from the Legal Services Corporation that at that time was trying to swell its ranks and encourage people to do poverty law by awarding these Reginald Heber Smith fellowships. At the time, it was controversial because not everybody agreed that poor people should be entitled to representation. So one congressman had labeled Reggies, as we were called, as the shock troops of the left, when in fact we were representing old people. I was representing, I've done dozens of domestic violence cases, housing evictions, other kinds of civil rights. I was able to work with a group of people at Santa Clara University Law School, met my wife, Suzanne Aitai, who became a co-founder of, along with Richard Konda and my future partner, Brad Yamauchi, of the Asian Law Alliance. which is now an established institution in the San Jose, Santa Clara County area, serving poor people, very much modeled after the Asian Law Caucus. So that was really my trajectory. And after doing that for about 8 years, I was pretty burned out. And because you're dealing with these enormous problems with very, very little resources. So the choices were corporate law, government service, private practice. And at that time, I'd known and met Dale Minami through, and you too, Lori, through the Korematsu, representing Fred Korematsu. And so he said, well, why don't you start your own practice? And I did as a solo, and then eventually merged the practice with Dale's group and with you. We were all together. And although it was a business, we were also committed to an ideology that we could actually affect change. And we did that. We saw it live, what could happen when a small group of determined people focused and believed in a mission, which was, in our case, the Korematsu case.
Can you say something about how you maintained a solo practice and then a partnership? They're really hard to maintain. You got bills to pay. Can you talk about that and balancing that with the Korematsu case and what it was meant to you to work representing Fred Korematsu and reopening his case?
It's nothing unique. I mean, everybody, not just lawyers, but whatever profession you're in, whatever the profession the viewers are in or going to be in, the life balance, the life-work balance issue is always difficult. And so you have all these competing priorities, but within that, you can make some choices, about why did you go to law school? For instance, for me anyway, I asked, why did I go to law school? What do I believe in? What does that memento I showed you really mean to me? And as busy as people are with their personal lives, their family, their career commitments, if you're determined, you will find a way. And so you have to pick your battles. You can't participate in everything. And I always look for issues that I thought I could have the most impact on change. So we did pick our issues. We had to run a business, but along the way, we were involved in some very significant pro bono legal issues, and found it as rewarding, not monetarily, but as rewarding as other parts of our practice.
So people are familiar with the Korematsu case. If you want to say something about working on it, that would be great, but maybe mention Sokobukai or some of the other pro bono cases you've been able to work on.
Well, I mean, just as a matter of lessons to pass on to viewers, perhaps. I mean, who would have thought? I mean, the Korematsu case was very significant to us for 3 reasons. And Lori, I know you can relate to this. This was a very personal thing. I mean, our families were the ones that were targeted and incarcerated, who went through this. And of course, our parents and our grandparents knew they weren't spies. They were not, had done no wrong. And this was a huge wrong. So the idea that we could actually do something about that and right a wrong was very significant to us. And then secondly, I think the other reasons to do this case was to impair as much as possible the Korematsu precedent, which really stood for the proposition that without a trial, without hearings, and without evidence, and on the naked accusation of the government alone, that this group is dangerous. Young people, old people, babies, infirm, healthy, they all could be rounded up and they could lose their freedom within an eye blink. People are surprised about COVID-19 and how fast that spread. In January, nobody was thinking about shelter in place. And then suddenly the whole nation goes through this. Well, when Japanese Americans, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, literally within weeks, they they were removed from their homes. And I think about my father wandering in Topaz, Utah, which is in the middle of a desert. He must have been thinking, how in the world did I get here? And so these are things that we thought about, and if we could educate the public and impair that precedent legally as much as possible, that was our goal. And I think the third one was, win or lose on the case, that we would rewrite the history on this so that it would never happen again to anyone else. I think the most shocking thing, however, is little did we realize that in the 1980s, when we reopened it, it's probably more relevant now in 2020 than it was when we reopened these cases.
Don, when President Roosevelt was making the decision to incarcerate Japanese Americans, did people within the administration speak up against this action?
Well, when the culture of prejudice really got going, and this is not new to anybody who studied this period of time, it was the most popular thing. I mean, every area of the country that you might expect to stand up for the Constitution really failed. And the National Board of the ACLU even issued a directive initially to all its local chapters not to represent Japanese Americans, if you can believe that. They changed their position, and that was a great thing, and ultimately funded and supported Fred Korematsu's appeal to the US Supreme Court. But it just goes to show that the incarceration and removal of Japanese Americans was popular. Earl Warren, the great Chief Justice of the United States, who led a unanimous court to overturn segregation in the 1954 case of Brown versus Board of Education. And then Attorney General Earl Warren of California ran for governor of the state on a slogan that the Japs must go. And he built his career on vilifying our community to his everlasting regret later, after he became a Supreme Court justice, as he had written in his memoirs. And so it was a very popular thing. And that teaches us, that's a lesson for us today when there are loose talk coming out of this administration that Islam hates us and Muslims are terrorists and Mexicans are drug dealers and rapists and press is the enemy of the people. All of these kinds of things collectively, we've seen this before in the experience of Japanese Americans. So that's a lesson that ought not to be forgotten.
There were a couple of lawyers within the Justice Department who did try and speak out and to tell the Supreme Court, to urging their superiors, urging the Solicitor General to tell the Supreme Court about the fact that the government was suppressing and altering and destroying evidence, but they were overruled. And so I think that it's really important to, I think all of us, particularly people who work in government or in firms that handle a variety of work, sometimes have to make decisions about, do we do everything we can for our client or to defend the government, or do we have certain principles we need to stand by? And Edward Ennis and John Burling did. We have another question that's kind of related to one I wanted to ask you anyway. The question is, do you feel we have more to do in terms of progressing since the time of the Japanese American incarceration? And so I guess what I'd like you to do is to talk about what you're doing now. What do you think the issues are for Asian Americans in particular, and for this country, that we not look at the Japanese American incarceration as just a piece of history? What are the issues now? And maybe as you answer that, think about how, or address how we can ally with the Black community in the national conversation about race.
Well, one of the great contributions of the Black Lives Matter movement is its focus on systemic racism. I mean, that's in other I mean, we haven't seen a movement like this in 50 years. And at that time, when Martin Luther King and John Lewis and others were leading those marches, it was about particular wrongs, like segregation, huge wrongs, but particular ones, voter suppression, housing discrimination, job discrimination, and so on. But the bigger picture was the culture of racism that produced all of that. And when we talk about the Japanese American incarceration, and Lori, you mentioned whistleblowers within the Department of Justice who knew at the time and informed the Solicitor General and the Attorney General that the Department of Justice was about to tell lies to the US Supreme Court in order to manipulate the outcome of the Korematsu decision, and that they had reports from the FBI, the Federal Communication, and the Navy, which categorically refuted the claims of the Army that Japanese Americans were engaged in espionage and sabotage, and characterized those claims as intentional falsehoods. That the culture of racism was so strong that even confronted with their own intelligence reports, ultimately they decided to suppress, alter, and even destroy that evidence. So it was never presented to the court. And the result was a civil liberties disaster. And it just is a lesson on how powerful this culture and systemic racism was. And we're seeing that played out again. And to the extent that the Black Lives Matter focuses on not just individual wrongs, horrible ones, like the murder of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Bethany Taylor, and so on, but the culture of racism that produces all of that, I think they're doing a great service. And to draw parallels with Japanese American incarceration, it is the same playbook. The playbook is appeals to prejudice to accomplish a political end, engage in fear-mongering and scapegoating, and then traffic in conspiracy theories, false information, alternative facts. And so in 1942, for our community, the conspiracy theory was, the Japanese race is an enemy race. In today's world, the conspiracy theory is Muslims are terrorists. So it warrants shutting down the borders and separating American families who happen to be of Islamic faith. And so all of those things suddenly become, very relevant. And I know when the 9/11 happened, Japanese Americans remembered that. And the JACL and other Japanese American, Asian American groups contacted Muslim American organizations and said, we support you. This has happened to us. We've been there. And that was an example of allyship that I thought was really important. And I'm proud of our community and our groups for doing that. We're at a moment now in history where I think we have, like I said, we haven't seen this in 50 years. And I think Asian Americans, Japanese Americans, others need to look inward and says, we know something about this because we know what it's like to be targeted. And in fact, we're only 1 or 2 degrees of separation from the people being targeted at the border now. And why do I say that? Is because when our leadership talks about Chinese flu and Kung flu and this sort of thing, and hate crimes against Asian Americans follow, it teaches us that although we might think that these issues involve, those brown people at the border, for example, we're not too far removed from that. And our own history, whether it's the incarceration or the Chinese Exclusion Act or any other number of instances, shows that we should be in allyship with other people of color, and we need to help address a culture of racism that produces these grotesque and terrible outcomes.
So what can we do? Not everybody can take a job in legal services with the National Civil Rights Organization. What can people do if they work in private firms, in government, and in different private industry? What can Asian Pacific Islanders concretely do to help change that culture this culture of racism?
So I think the first thing is education and awareness of what is going on and how our own history intersects with the histories of other people of color in the society, and not just on race basis, but on religion and in some of the other areas that people are being targeted for. I think that's the first step, and then there are so many things that people can do. And I realize as a practical matter, I mean, people have to think about their careers, their livelihoods, their families. But I think we have to fight hard and intentionally to carve out some time and some devotion to the public weal, put it that way, and not just government service, but volunteerism in general. I think most of the viewers are probably looking toward a career in government service, and that's certainly one way of contributing and being a change agent. But that's not the only way. There's more than one way to skin a cat. I think my career is sort of emblematic of that. I started out as a poverty and civil rights lawyer, ultimately ended up in my own private practice, and then joined with another group of like-minded people like yourself and Dale Minami and others, and still along the way find a way to contribute. And big and small, it doesn't matter. I mean, whether it's being civically engaged and running for office, or writing a check to support the nominee of your choice or the cause of your choice, or working with schools on curriculum, or working in your networks or churches, temples, synagogues. I think all of that is critical. And ultimately, what we're talking about is changing hearts and minds and changing the culture in big and small ways. That sounds huge, right? But all change really is local. It sounds trite and trivial, but it is true. Every major change in history, not just American history, but in history, really starts with a handful of people with an idea. And, when you think about the road that's about to be traveled, people think it's impossible, you can't do it. And how many times, Lori, did people tell us, there's no way to reopen the Korematsu case? You're doomed to failure. I mean, even retired Supreme Court Justice Arthur Goldberg, in an op-ed piece, opined that, there's some group out there, referring to us, looking to reopen the Korematsu case. They shouldn't do it. It's not possible. It's doomed to failure. And, whether it was the ignorance of youth or just our idealism, we believed in the cause and our efforts. So I think self-education first is important, and then find a way to get involved.
There's a lot to be said for idealism. Let me also say, Dawn's being a bit shy about this. What Dawn's doing right now, along with me and Dale Minami and a whole bunch of other people, is we're speaking around the country about the Korematsu case, the Japanese American incarceration, and upholding the rule of law and the present day relevance of the incarceration. And so please, the link to Stop Repeating History is in the chat box. And this is part of Dawn's continuing activism, which is so incredibly important right now. So let me just ask two more questions as we wrap up. One is from the audience. Japanese Americans were successful in securing reparations for incarceration. Why has the country not addressed reparations for Blacks? And I guess I would add to that, where do we stand as Asian Americans in that conversation?
I think the time is now to address that. When we, in the 70s, 60s and 70s, they didn't call it reparations, but we did have a war on poverty, so-called, model cities, affirmative action, all of those which were designed to level the playing field. But I think more to the point, reparations and then dealing with this culture of racism and the outcome of that, and really examining both the economic and psychological impact of slavery is critical. And we know, looking at our president, that generational wealth is passed on from one generation to the next, but so too generational poverty, and so too generational trauma. Just in, you can't compare the incarceration of Japanese Americans to 400 years of slavery and enforced segregation. But even that little bit of injustice that Japanese Americans went through, I mean, Lori and I could talk about the generational trauma that is passed on from one generation to the next. And so I think those things should be addressed. I think the one model could be how Japanese American reparations was established. And that was to commission hearings around the country, which allowed people to talk about their experience. And that had a tremendous impact in educating the public and getting them to understand about why reparations would be appropriate. So as far as Asian Americans are concerned, I think that's something we need to look into and support.
So Don, thank you so much. One last question. To you, what does it mean to be a resilient leader?
I can tell you what I say to myself, and I've said this ever since I was in law school, and that is there's so many competing priorities and worries and anxieties and obligations and responsibilities that people encounter that it's difficult to in addition volunteer, contribute to the public, engage in a life of public service, this sort of thing. So what I said to myself is, I should never lose my capacity to be outraged at what is fundamentally wrong. You got to fight to maintain that outrage. And it's kind of a negative way for me to think about it, but it's effective. I mean, personally, currently, if we ever get numb to Chinese virus and Kung flu and Mexicans are drug dealers and rapists and Islam hates us and the press is the enemy of the people, and when it's okay to shout down dissenters and retaliate against whistleblowers, if that's all okay, if that becomes normal as part of our culture, if that's the way the country is moving, history tells us, and not just American history, I'm talking about pre-war Germany, other democratic societies that were lost, but certainly American history too. History teaches us, and Japanese American incarceration is one great example, where the country can descend very quickly into a very dark place, where in fact neither the Constitution nor even facts matter. And so all of these things that we're inundated with now, all of the messaging, we're understandably fatigued and we become numb to it. But I would remind the audience, as I remind ourselves, to never lose the capacity to be outraged about what is wrong. Don't let it become normal. Get in there and never be, you can't be a bystander to history now. So that would be my closing message.
Thank you so much, Don and Lori, for joining us today. It's so important to not repeat history, and I greatly appreciate all of your work to educate the public. So thank you for joining us. And to our audience, please be sure to tune in on Tuesday, August 25th at 2 p.m. Eastern. We will be joined by Major General Robert G.F. Lee, U.S. Army retired and former Adjutant General, State of Hawaii. Please feel free to sign up on our website at apaics.org. So enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and thank you for joining us. See you the next time.
Thank you.
So much.